The wind was a living thing in the high country of the Montana Territory, a beast with a voice that moaned through the pines and clawed at the chinks in Elijah's cabin. It was a late winter in the waning years of the 1880s, a time when the land was still raw, and the people who clung to it were often just as untamed. Out here, silence was the common tongue, and survival was the only prayer that mattered. The earth was frozen solid, and so were the hearts of most men who chose to face it alone. It was a place for survivors, and every survivor carried scars, some on their skin, most on their soul. Elijah was such a man. His ranch was little more than a hardy cabin, a staunch barn, and a few dozen acres of land carved from the unforgiving foothills of the mountains. It was a fortress of solitude he had built not to keep the world out, but to keep his memories in. It had been 2 years since the fever had come like a thief in the night. 2 years since he had dug 2 graves on the rise behind the cabin, one heartbreakingly small. The silence that had followed the last shovel of dirt was a weight that had never lifted. His wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Lily. Their laughter was a ghost that haunted the rafters, their absence a hollow ache in his chest that the cold could never quite numb. He lived by the rhythm of necessity. He rose before the sun, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only conversation he held most days. He tended his cattle, their lowing a mournful choir against the vast, indifferent sky. He cooked his solitary meals, ate from the same tin plate, and stared into the fire, seeing faces in the flames that were no longer there. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts: grief, grit, and a quiet endurance that was its own form of defiance against a God he no longer spoke to. Tonight, the wind was particularly cruel, driving a sleet-laced snow sideways against the single glass-paned window of his cabin. The world outside was a churning vortex of white and gray. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled and spat, a lone beacon of warmth in the immense cold. Elijah sat at his rough-hewn table, cleaning his rifle with a slow, methodical precision that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far down the dark trails of memory. The scent of gun oil, wood smoke, and brewing coffee filled the small space. It was a lonely smell, the smell of his life now. A sound, faint at first, snagged his attention. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of the timbers. It was something sharper, more desperate. A frantic knocking, nearly lost in the gale. Elijah froze, his hands stilling on the rifle stock. No one came to his door. Trappers and prospectors knew this land belonged to him, and the folks from the nearest town, a hard 2-day ride away, had no cause to seek him out. Trouble, he thought. Trouble always traveled in a storm. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, grabbing the rifle. He wasn't a man given to fear, but he was a man given to caution. He peered through the small window, but the swirling snow was a curtain he couldn't see through. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice, a woman's voice, thin and sharp with panic. With a grim set to his jaw, Elijah moved to the door, his thumb resting on the rifle's hammer. He lifted the thick wooden bar and pulled the heavy door inward. A blast of icy wind and snow surged into the cabin, making the fire dance wildly and the lanterns flicker. Framed in the doorway were 2 figures, spectral and caked in white. They looked less like people and more like statues carved from ice and desperation. For a moment, he could only stare. The first was a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, framed by strands of dark, wet hair plastered to her skin. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away everything else. She was trembling violently, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were holding something, or someone, that was no longer there. Her shivering was a frantic, uncontrollable shudder that shook her from head to toe. Beside her stood another woman, slightly older, taller. She held the younger one by the arm, her stance a stark contrast. Where the young one was a storm of panic, This one was a pillar of grim resolve. Her face was set, her jaw tight, but her eyes held a different kind of pain, not the wild terror of her companion, but a deep, settled bitterness laced with a shame so heavy it seemed to bend her shoulders. She met Elijah's gaze directly, her own look a mixture of plea and defiance. "Please," the older one said, her voice raspy but clear over the wind's howl. "Shelter. Just for the night. We're lost." Elijah's first instinct was to say no. His home was a sanctuary for his grief, not a haven for wayward strangers. Women, especially, they were a complication he had no room for in his life, a reminder of all he had lost. His gaze was hard, suspicious. "Where you from?" he grunted, his voice rough from disuse. "A town east of here," the woman answered, her grip tightening on the younger one, who had begun to sob quietly, a desperate, gasping sound. "We had to leave." "Leave in a blizzard?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Folks don't just leave in a storm like this unless they're running from something." The older woman's chin lifted a fraction. "We are," she said, her voice dropping, thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Please, sir, my sister, she's not well, and she's lost her child. The fever took him just 3 days ago. She can't stay out in this cold." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Fever. Lost her child. The two phrases echoed in the hollow chambers of his own heart. He looked at the younger woman. Clara, though he didn't know her name yet. He saw the frantic, empty way her arms were clutched to her chest, and he understood. It was the posture of a mother whose arms suddenly had nothing to hold. He had seen that same desperate emptiness in his own wife's eyes in her final days. The cold armor around his heart cracked, just a little, cursing under his breath, a low, guttural sound of frustration. He stepped back. "Get in," he said, the words torn from him, "before you both freeze to the porch." They stumbled inside, bringing the storm in with them. The older one, Miriam, practically had to drag Clara, whose legs seemed barely able to hold her, as Elijah barred the door, shutting out the screaming wind. The sudden silence of the cabin felt immense, charged with the presence of these two strange, wounded birds who had fallen from the sky and landed on his doorstep. He watched them. Clara collapsed onto the floor by the hearth, not with relief but with a total, boneless exhaustion, her sobs now racking her entire body. Miriam knelt beside her, pulling off her own frozen cloak and wrapping it around her sister's shaking shoulders, murmuring words too low for him to hear. Elijah stood by the door, the rifle still held loosely in his hand. A sentinel in his own home, he felt like an intruder. The air was thick with their fear, their grief, and the unspoken questions that hung between them. He gestured stiffly with the barrel of the rifle towards the fire. "Warm yourselves." Miriam looked up, her gratitude warring with her pride. "Thank you," she whispered. She worked to remove Clara's soaked cloak, her movements gentle but efficient. Beneath it, Clara was wearing a simple, worn dress, far too thin for the weather. She was so young, Elijah realized. Probably not yet 20. Miriam herself was perhaps only a few years older, but she carried herself with the weary gravity of a much older woman. Elijah turned away. Setting the rifle back on its rack, he felt a powerful urge to retreat, to put a wall back up between himself and their raw, palpable sorrow. He poured 3 cups of the scalding black coffee, his hands moving with the familiar, steady rhythm of his solitude. He placed 2 mugs on the edge of the hearth, a good few feet from where they huddled, and took his own back to the table. He sat, cradling the warm tin in his hands, watching them over the rim. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, Clara's ragged weeping, and the howl of the wind outside. Finally, Miriam managed to get her sister to sip some of the coffee. The warmth seemed to calm her shivering slightly. Her sobs subsided into a quiet, rhythmic hiccuping. her vacant eyes fixed on the flames. Miriam finally rose and came to the table. Though she didn't sit, she stood across from him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "My name is Miriam. That's my sister, Clara." Elijah just nodded, not offering his own name. "You said you were running." It wasn't a question. It was a demand for the truth he felt he was owed for his hospitality. Miriam's gaze dropped to the floorboards for a moment, the shame he'd seen earlier flushing her cheeks. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and steady. "Our husbands. They both died last year. The mine collapse. Clara had just given birth to her son, Thomas. It was all she had left." She paused, swallowing hard. "We were living in the boarding house run by the church, helping out." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was brittle. "There was a situation, a misunderstanding with the pastor. He made advances. When I refused him, he turned the story around. He told the elders that I had tried to tempt him from his righteous path, that my sister and I were women of loose morals. He used Clara's grief against her, saying it had made her unstable, that she was a bad influence." Elijah remained silent, his face unreadable, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his cup. He knew of men like that, men who used God's word as a shield for their own sin. "The town," Miriam continued, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "They believed him. Of course, they believed him. We were just two widows with no man to speak for us. They asked us to leave. The church elders, for the good of the community. They said—" Her laugh was a short, bitter sound. "Then little Thomas took sick, the fever. We tried to get the doctor, but he was slow to come. He said it was God's will, that sickness follows sin." Clara let out a low moan from the hearth, as if reliving it. "We buried him yesterday morning," Miriam finished, her voice now a flat, dead thing. "And we left. We had nowhere else to go. We just started walking west." The story settled in the small cabin, as heavy and cold as the snow piling up outside. They were victims, cast out and condemned. Elijah looked at the two of them, one broken by grief, the other hardened by injustice. He felt a reluctant stir of empathy, a dangerous thing for a man who wanted only to be left alone. He understood what it was to be helpless against fate, to watch sickness steal what you loved most. And he understood the judgment of small towns, the way piety could curdle into cruelty. Still, his own survival depended on caution. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words sounding stiff and inadequate in the charged silence. "But I can't keep you here." Miriam's face fell, but she nodded, as if she had expected nothing more. "We know. We're not asking for charity, just until the storm passes. We can work, we can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just about pity. It was now a negotiation. Three isolated souls, trapped by a blizzard, trying to find their footing. The cabin, which had always felt empty but spacious enough for his own grief, now felt impossibly small, crowded with their sorrow, their shame, and their sheer, undeniable presence. He could feel their eyes on him, even when they weren't looking. He was acutely aware of the soft sound of their breathing, the rustle of their clothes, the scent of wet wool and something faintly floral, a scent that hadn't been in this cabin for 2 long years. It was unsettling. It was an intrusion. It was a crack in the wall of his solitude, and he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be sealed or broken wide open. He felt the familiar pull of compassion, the thing that had made Sarah love him, but he also felt the hard, pragmatic need for self-preservation that the wilderness had taught him. Helping them was a risk. Letting them go was a cruelty he wasn't sure he could live with. He looked from Miriam's proud, weary face to Clara's devastated, childlike one. He thought of his own daughter, Lily, and a pang of something fierce and protective shot through him. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the quiet room. "There's a loft," he said, gesturing with his head toward the ladder in the corner. "You can sleep there. There are extra blankets in the chest." He walked over to the hearth and added another log to the fire, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. He didn't look at them. He was setting the terms, drawing the lines that would keep them separate, keep him safe. "You can stay until the snow melts enough for travel. A few days, maybe a week. You can help with the cooking and keeping the cabin, in exchange for food and shelter. When the path is clear, I'll point you toward the next town. That's the deal." He finally turned to face them. His eyes were hard again, his voice leaving no room for argument. "That's all it is, a deal. Nothing more." Miriam simply nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief. "Thank you," she breathed, the words full of a gratitude so profound it made him uncomfortable. She went to her sister, helping the still-dazed Clara to her feet and guiding her toward the ladder. Elijah watched them climb into the shadows of the loft. He heard the rustle of blankets, a few whispered words, and then silence. He was alone again, but the cabin felt different. It was no longer just his. It was a shelter, a temporary refuge, filled with the ghosts of 3 dead loved ones and the troubled breathing of 2 living strangers. He stood by the fire, listening to the storm outside and the quieter, more complicated storm that had just blown in through his door. The deal was made, but he had a sinking feeling that the price would be far more than just a little cooking and cleaning. The days that followed settled into a strange and silent rhythm, dictated by the ceaseless demands of winter and the unspoken grief that filled the small cabin. The storm that had brought the sisters to his door eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a world buried in a pristine, blinding whiteness. The snow was deep, the drifts immense, rendering any thought of travel impossible. They were marooned together in a landscape of stark and silent beauty. At night, Elijah would lie on his cot by the fire, the place he'd surrendered to the sisters, and listen to the sounds from the loft. He would hear Miriam's steady, quiet breathing, but it was often punctuated by the heartbreakingly soft sounds of Clara weeping. It was a stifled, desperate sound, the kind of crying a person does when they believe no one is listening. She was mourning her lost child, her lost life, in the dark, and each sob was a tiny needle prick in the thick hide of Elijah's solitude. During the day, Clara was a ghost. She moved through the cabin with a listless fragility, her eyes often fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, her hands sometimes cradling the air in front of her as if holding the memory of a weight. Miriam was her sister's opposite. She rose before Elijah, her movements quiet and purposeful. She seemed driven by a need to erase her own presence through sheer utility, as if she could pay for their sanctuary with relentless labor. She scrubbed the floors with a fierce energy, mended Elijah's worn clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and cooked meals that were simple but nourishing, coaxing Clara to eat with a gentle, persistent patience. There was a penance in her every action. She worked as if trying to scrub away the shame that had been unjustly thrust upon her, her silence a wall against the world that had condemned her. Elijah watched them, a silent observer from behind the ramparts he had built around his heart. He had intended to keep his distance, to treat this as a simple transaction of shelter for labor, but the human heart is a stubborn and contrary thing. He found himself noticing the small, selfless acts that passed between the sisters. He saw Miriam discreetly give Clara the larger portion of stew at supper, claiming she wasn't hungry. He saw her rise in the cold of the night to add another blanket to her sleeping sister in the loft. He saw the way her hand would find Clara's shoulder, a brief, reassuring touch that spoke volumes in the quiet cabin. He saw a fierce, protective love that was both beautiful and painful to witness. These were not fallen women, as their town had branded them. They were survivors, tending to each other's wounds in the only way they knew how. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid boundaries of their arrangement began to soften. The daily chores, once markers of their separate lives, became threads that wove them together. The morning began not with words, but with a shared ritual. Elijah would rise and stir the embers of the fire back to life. Miriam would descend from the loft, and soon the smell of coffee would fill the air. They would sit, the three of them, in the dim pre-dawn light, sipping the hot, bitter liquid from tin mugs. The silence between them no longer strained and awkward, but comfortable, companionable. It was a quiet truce, a shared moment of warmth before facing the cold realities of the day. One afternoon, the wind kicked up again, a ferocious gale that threatened to rip the canvas tarp from the haystack beside the barn, hay that was crucial for the cattle's survival. Elijah shouted a warning and ran outside. A moment later, both Miriam and Clara were there behind him, their skirts whipping in the wind. For 20 frantic minutes, they fought the storm as one. He yelled instructions over the roar of the wind, and they obeyed without hesitation, their faces raw from the cold, their hands clumsy in the biting air. They wrestled with the flapping canvas, their fingers brushing as they fumbled for the ropes. Together, they managed to secure it with heavy stones and spare logs. When it was finally done, they stumbled back towards the cabin, breathless and shivering, united by the small, desperate victory against the elements, inside, as they huddled by the fire, catching their breath. Miriam looked at him, a flicker of a smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it lit her face with a warmth that startled him, and he felt an unfamiliar answering stir within himself. The relentless work and the gnawing anxiety, however, were taking their toll. Miriam had been running on sheer will for too long. One evening, as she was helping Elijah bring in the last of the firewood for the night, her strength finally gave out. She set her armload of logs down by the hearth, swayed on her feet, and then crumpled to the floor in a dead faint before he could reach her. Clara screamed, a raw, terrified sound, but Elijah moved with a swiftness that surprised even himself. He knelt, felt the heat radiating from Miriam's skin, and knew instantly it was a fever. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child, her head lolled against his shoulder, her body limp in his arms. The hard, capable woman who had faced him with such defiance on his porch was gone, replaced by someone utterly vulnerable. He carried her to his own cot, the only proper bed in the cabin. "Get a basin of cold water and a cloth," he ordered Clara, his voice calm and steady, cutting through her panic. For the rest of that night, he became a caretaker, a role he hadn't played in 2 long years, yet one his body remembered with a muscle memory forged in grief. Clara hovered uselessly, wringing her hands, her own sorrow rendering her helpless in the face of this new crisis. So Elijah took charge. He sat by Miriam's side, dipping the cloth in the cool water and laying it gently on her fevered brow. She thrashed weakly, muttering names and phrases from a delirious dream. He saw her then, truly saw her, for the first time, not as the proud, shamed woman, but as Miriam. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the chapped softness of her lips, the pulse beating rapidly in the delicate arch of her throat. Her strength had been a shield, and now, with it gone, he saw the deep weariness she carried. He remembered sitting just like this, in this very spot, holding Sarah's hand as the fever consumed her. The memory rose, sharp and painful, but something was different. This wasn't the agonizing helplessness of watching a loved one fade away. This was a fight. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in him, a primal urge to shield this woman from the darkness that threatened to take her. He wasn't just tending to a stranger. He was fighting for a life that had, without his permission, become intertwined with his own. He brewed a strong herbal tea his wife had sworn by and patiently coaxed spoonfuls of the warm liquid between her parted lips. He stayed with her through the long, dark hours, listening to her ragged breathing and the ever-present moan of the wind, a lonely vigil against the night. By dawn, the fever broke. Miriam's breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. Elijah sat back, exhausted but relieved. The first light of morning painting the cabin in pale, gray strokes. He looked at her sleeping face, peaceful now, and felt a profound sense of connection, a tenderness that frightened him with its intensity. The next few days were quiet as Miriam recovered her strength. The incident had shifted the delicate balance in the cabin. There was a new awareness between them, a fragile intimacy born from that long night of sickness. But this new closeness also frayed Clara's already tenuous grip on her emotions. One night, a piercing scream ripped through the silence. Elijah, who had taken to sleeping on a bedroll by the fire to be near Miriam, was on his feet in an instant. It was Clara, sitting bolt upright in the loft, her eyes wide with the terror of a nightmare. "Thomas!" she cried, her voice a raw wound. "They're taking him! Don't let them take my baby!" "Clara," Miriam called weakly from the cot, trying to sit up. "Stay put," Elijah commanded Miriam gently. He climbed the ladder to the loft. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he could see Clara trembling, lost in a waking horror. He reached out, not to touch her, but to offer a steadying presence. "Clara," he said softly, his voice the low, calm rumble he used to soothe a spooked horse. "It was just a dream. You're safe. He's at peace." He didn't know if they were the right words, but they were the only ones he had. But Clara, in her grief-stricken delusion, didn't see a stranger. She saw a protector. With a choked sob, she launched herself forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him with the desperate strength of a drowning soul. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, her body shaking with violent sobs. Elijah froze, his entire body going rigid. The sudden, unexpected contact was a shock to his system. He felt the slimness of her frame, the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs, the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. It had been so long since he had held anyone, so long since he had felt the warmth of another human body pressed against his. For a split second, a primal, long-dormant instinct flickered to life within him, a jolt of pure, physical awareness. He could smell the clean scent of her hair, feel the desperate, clutching grip of her hands on his back. Then, just as quickly, the ghost of his wife rose in his mind, Sarah's face, smiling, then wasting away. This felt like a betrayal, a profanity against her memory. Guilt, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He stood there, stiff and unmoving as a statue, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides, caught between the instinct to comfort and the urge to recoil. And across the cabin, in the shadows, he knew Miriam was watching. He couldn't see her face clearly, but he could feel her gaze. He could feel her silent, knowing presence in the charged air. Finally, Clara's sobs subsided, and she seemed to realize what she was doing. She pulled back abruptly, her face flushed with shame. I'm sorry," she stammered, scrambling back to her blankets. "I didn't—" "It's all right," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "Just a bad dream." He retreated down the ladder, his heart pounding a heavy, uneven rhythm in his chest. The final days of that week passed in a thick, suffocating silence. The air in the cabin was heavy with all the things that had been stirred up and left unsaid. Miriam was stronger now, moving about the cabin again, but her eyes were guarded. Clara was withdrawn and quiet, her shame a palpable thing, and Elijah was at war with himself. He was a man who had made his peace with being alone. Yet now his solitude was filled with the presence of these two women. He would look at Miriam, at her quiet strength and the weary wisdom in her eyes, and feel a deep, unsettling pull of admiration and desire. Then he would see Clara, with her fragile beauty and her devastating vulnerability, and feel an equally powerful, though different, urge to protect and to hold. This new, unwanted life stirring within him felt like a desecration of the love he had for Sarah. His desire was a sin, his longing a betrayal. The cabin, once his refuge, had become a crucible. testing him, tormenting him with a choice he didn't want to make. That evening, they sat down to dinner. Miriam had made a rabbit stew, and the savory aroma filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the stark silence at the table. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the crackle of the fire. No one looked at each other, yet they were all intensely aware of one another. Elijah could feel Miriam's perceptive gaze on him, a gaze that was not accusatory, but filled with a sad, profound understanding. She knew. She saw his torment, and she held her peace. Clara kept her eyes downcast, fixed on her bowl, a blush of shame still lingering on her cheeks. Elijah looked from one woman to the other, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. He saw their pain, their resilience, their quiet beauty, and he felt the terrible, aching hunger of a lonely heart. The silence stretched on, thick with endurance, with unspoken questions, and with the heavy, patient weight of waiting for a word that no one yet had the courage to speak. Winter, which had before been merely a hardship, now became a siege. The sun became a distant, theoretical thing, a pale disk that skimmed the horizon for a few hours each day before surrendering the world back to a deep and penetrating cold. The wind was a starved wolf, howling relentlessly around the corners of the cabin, searching for any weakness, their supply of firewood, which Elijah had thought would last until the thaw, was dwindling at an alarming rate. Food became a matter of careful rationing. The salted pork was running low. The sacks of flour and beans were noticeably lighter. Every meal was a quiet calculation against the future. The isolation pressed in on them, a tangible force. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the snow-swept path to the barn, and the vast, oppressive whiteness that surrounded them. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface since Clara's nightmare now became a constant, suffocating presence. The three of them moved around each other with a careful, deliberate choreography, their bodies trying to maintain a distance their circumstances would not allow. Glances were brief, words were clipped and necessary, and the silence was filled with the things they were all desperately trying not to feel. The breaking point came on a day when the wind reached a new level of fury. A violent gust, a sound like the world tearing in half, was followed by a splintering crash from the direction of the barn. Elijah was already pulling on his heavy coat and boots before the sound had fully died away. The main gate to the corral, the one he had built with his own hands from thick, seasoned pine, had been ripped from one of its hinges and was now swinging wildly, threatening to shatter completely and release his cattle into the blizzard. "Stay inside," he grunted at the women, his voice tight with urgency as he grabbed a hammer and a pouch of heavy nails. But as he plunged into the blinding maelstrom of snow and wind, he heard the cabin door open and close behind him. It was Miriam. She had wrapped a thick wool shawl around her head and shoulders, and she carried a coil of heavy rope. "You can't do this alone," she shouted over the wind, her words snatched away almost as soon as they left her lips. There was no time to argue. He just gave her a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of her grit. The work was brutal. The wind tore at them, driving the icy snow into their faces with the force of flung gravel. It was a physical assault that stole their breath and numbed their fingers within minutes. They struggled to force the heavy gate back into position, their shoulders pressed together, their combined strength barely a match for the storm's power. Elijah hammered at the broken hinge, his gloved hands clumsy, the metal of the hammer so cold it felt like it was burning his skin. Miriam, meanwhile, fought to lash the gate to the fence post with the rope, her body braced against the wind, her skirts plastered to her legs. They were working in a desperate, synchronized rhythm when it happened. A sudden, vicious gust of wind caught the gate, swinging it with violent force. The movement threw them both off balance on the slick, snow-covered ground. Miriam cried out as her feet went out from under her. Elijah reached for her instinctively, his own footing already compromised. They fell together, a tangle of limbs, into a deep snowdrift against the side of the barn. The fall knocked the wind out of them, And, for a moment, the world was silent, muffled by the snow. The howling of the wind seemed distant. They had landed with him partially on top of her, his body shielding her from the worst of the impact. The snow was cold and soft around them, a temporary cradle from the storm. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his face just inches from hers. And in that instant, the cold, the wind, and the danger all ceased to exist. All that existed was her face, framed by the snow-dusted shawl. Her cheeks flushed red from the cold, her lips slightly parted, her eyes, wide and startled, were fixed on his. He saw a flicker of fear in them, but beneath it, something else, something deep and resonant that mirrored the sudden, roaring fire in his own blood. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his face, a small, intimate cloud in the frigid air. The scent of her, clean and faintly of wood smoke, filled his senses. The long-suppressed hunger, the deep, aching loneliness of 2 years, rose up in him with a force that was terrifying. He wanted to lower his head, to close the small distance between them, to taste the warmth and life he saw in her eyes. It was an impulse so powerful it was a physical pain. Miriam's gaze held his, and she did not pull away. Her own breath hitched, and he saw her swallow. In her eyes, he saw not just a reflection of his own desire, but a profound, weary yearning of her own. A silent question passed between them, an acknowledgement of the fragile, dangerous territory they had just stumbled into. The moment stretched, timeless and charged, before the reality of the cold and the still flapping gates shattered it. He pushed himself off her, scrambling to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaky as she accepted the hand he offered to pull her up. Their fingers touched, his calloused and numb, hers smaller but surprisingly strong. The contact sent another jolt through him. They didn't speak another word, turning back to the task at hand with a frantic, renewed energy, both of them desperate to escape the intimacy of what had just happened. They didn't know they had been seen. From the cabin window, Clara had watched the entire scene unfold. She had been wiping the condensation from the glass to see if they were safe when she saw them fall. She saw them disappear into the snowdrift, and her heart leaped into her throat with fear. But then she saw Elijah rise above Miriam, saw them stay there, motionless, for a beat that stretched into an eternity. Even from a distance, through the swirling snow, the intensity of the moment was unmistakable. It was a private, sealed world from which she was excluded. She watched as he helped Miriam up, saw the brief touch of their hands, and something cold and heavy settled in her stomach. It was a complex, ugly feeling she didn't want to name. It was the fearful confusion of a younger sister seeing her protector, her only constant, turning her attention to another. It was the bitter sting of jealousy, a feeling she hadn't known since her husband was alive. And beneath it all was a deep, profound sadness, a fresh wave of her own loneliness crashing over her. She was the broken one, the child woman lost in her grief, while Miriam was strong and capable, able to stand beside a man in a storm. Clara backed away from the window, her hands pressed to her mouth, and retreated to the shadows of the loft. That night, the cabin was more silent than ever. The gate was secured. The storm had lessened to a mournful sigh, but the tempest inside the cabin had grown to a fever pitch. Elijah lay on his bedroll, staring into the dying embers of the fire, his mind replaying the moment in the snow over and over again. He could still feel the phantom sensation of Miriam's body beneath his, still see the look in her eyes. The guilt was a sharp-toothed animal, gnawing at his insides. Guilt for desiring another woman. Guilt for the flicker of life he felt when he thought he was supposed to be dead inside, a walking memorial to his wife and daughter. He must have drifted into a restless sleep because he was startled awake by a sound, not a sound, but a presence. He opened his eyes. A figure was standing over him, a pale silhouette against the faint orange glow of the embers. It was Clara. "Clara?" he whispered, Sitting up. "What is it? Another nightmare?" She didn't answer. She just sank to her knees beside his bedroll. In the dim light, he could see that her face was streaked with silent tears. Her hands were twisting the fabric of her nightdress, her whole body trembling. "I'm so empty," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "There's nothing left inside me. He's gone, and it's just a hollow place. I feel so cold all the time, and I don't think I'll ever be warm again." Her pain was so palpable it was like a physical presence in the air. Elijah's heart ached for her. This was not the frightened girl from the nightmare. This was a woman drowning in a grief so vast it had erased her. I need to feel something," she sobbed, the words barely audible. "Something other than this. I need to know I'm still alive." And then, before he could process what was happening, she leaned forward. Her hand, small and trembling, came up to touch his cheek. Her skin was cool, her touch hesitant, like a child reaching for a flame. Then she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of utter, soul-crushing desperation. It was chaste and clumsy, tasting of salt and sorrow. For a moment, Elijah was frozen, his mind screaming at him to pull away, that this was wrong, a violation of every boundary, every memory he held sacred. But his body, starved for 2 years of any human touch, betrayed him as she pressed closer, her soft, trembling form fitting against his. A deep, primal need he had thought long dead roared to life. He was only a man, after all, a lonely, grieving man. His arm came up, his hand finding the small of her back, pulling her closer without his conscious permission. The moments that followed were a blur of confusion, need, and profound sadness. It was a frantic, desperate coupling, driven not by love or even lust, but by a shared, unspoken need to obliterate the pain, if only for a few fleeting minutes. It was a collision of two lonely, broken people, seeking warmth in the darkness. But even in the heat of it, it was incomplete. There was no joy, no release, only a desperate, aching intensity that felt more like a continuation of their suffering than a respite from it. Through it all, a single thought burned in Elijah's mind, the image of Sarah's face, her eyes full of a sorrowful disappointment, and above them, in the loft, he was acutely aware of the silent, sleeping form of Miriam. The guilt was a suffocating shroud. When it was over, they lay in silence, not touching. The act had not filled the emptiness inside Clara. It seemed only to have carved it deeper. She was crying again, silently this time, her shoulders shaking. Elijah felt a profound wave of self-loathing wash over him. He had not offered her comfort. He had only taken advantage of her pain, and in doing so, had betrayed his own. Without a word, Clara rose and slipped away, a ghost returning to the shadows of the loft. Elijah lay there for a long time, the cold seeping back into his bones, feeling more alone than he ever had before. The next morning broke cold and gray. The atmosphere in the cabin was so thick with unspoken truths it was hard to breathe. Elijah couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Clara remained in the loft, refusing to come down. And Miriam was quiet, too quiet. Elijah was outside, checking the corral. When he saw her, she was standing by the woodpile, her movements calm and deliberate. She was bundling her few belongings, a spare dress, a small book, into her cloak. She was preparing to leave. A cold panic seized him. He strode over to her, his boots crunching in the snow. "What are you doing?" Miriam didn't look at him. She continued to methodically tie a knot in the bundle. "The snow has stopped. The path will be hard, but passable soon. It's time we were on our way." "In this?" he demanded, gesturing at the frozen landscape. "You won't last a day." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were clear, devoid of anger or accusation, but filled with a deep, heart-wrenching sadness. She knew. Of course, she knew. She had heard. Or perhaps she had just sensed it in the charged air of the cabin. "My sister needs to be away from here," she said, her voice even. "And so do I. We've imposed on you for too long." She was making it easy for him, offering him an honorable exit from the mess he had created. But he couldn't take it. The thought of them walking out into that wilderness, of never seeing her again, was a physical blow. All the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled. "Don't," he said, his voice cracking. He reached out and put his hand on her arm, stopping her. "Miriam, don't go." She stood perfectly still, her eyes searching his face. "I know what you think," he stammered, the words coming hard and clumsy. He was not a man for speeches. "Last night, it was a mistake. She was hurting and I—" He trailed off, unable to explain the tangle of pity, guilt, and his own damnable weakness. "That's not an excuse," he finally managed, "but it's not the whole truth either." He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze. To be honest, for the first time since they had arrived. "The truth is, I have feelings for you too," he said, the confession feeling like it was being ripped from his soul. "Ever since you got here, and it's tearing me apart. I don't want to hurt her, and God knows, I don't want to hurt you." He expected anger, disgust, maybe even a slap. What he didn't expect was for her composure to finally, completely shatter. Her face crumpled, and a single tear traced a path down her cold cheek, followed by another, and another. She began to weep, not with the loud, frantic sobs of her sister, but with a deep, silent, body-racking grief that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "All my life," she whispered through her tears, her voice thick with a lifetime of pain. "People have only ever asked me one thing. What do you have to trade for our kindness? What work will you do? What penance will you pay?" She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with a vulnerability he had never seen before. "No one," she said, her voice breaking. "No one has ever asked me what I want." The simple, devastating truth of her words struck him silent. He saw her then, not as a complication or an object of his confused desire, but as a woman who had been bartered, judged, and condemned her entire life, a woman whose own heart had never been considered. He led her back inside the cabin, his hand still on her arm. He sat her down at the table and called softly up to the loft. "Clara, please come down." A few moments later, Clara descended the ladder, her face pale and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed with shame. She wouldn't look at either of them. The three of them sat there at the rough-hewn table, the fire crackling in the hearth. The silence was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of avoidance, but of anticipation. Elijah cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. "All of us." He looked from Miriam's tear-streaked face to Clara's downcast one. "We're all broken. We're all running from something. And this place, this winter, it's forcing us to face it, to face each other." He looked at them, these two women who had shattered his solitude and awakened his heart, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same. They were at a crossroads, trapped in a tiny cabin at the edge of the world, with only their shared wounds and a fragile, terrifying hope to guide them. And for the first time, they were going to face it together. The small, rough-hewn table became a confessional. The flickering firelight the only witness, the air was still and heavy, charged with the weight of unsaid words. Elijah had thrown down the gauntlet with his simple declaration, "We need to talk," and now the silence waited to be filled. It was a terrifying, sacred space, a precipice on which they all stood, knowing that to speak their truths would change everything, and to remain silent would be a slower, more certain kind of death. Clara spoke first, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the fire's crackle. She didn't look up from her hands, which were clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. "My husband, Jacob, his family were good people, I suppose, God-fearing. But they were hard. They owned the biggest mercantile in town, and all they understood was value, what something was worth, and a wife. A wife was worth the sons she could provide. She took a shaky breath, the story beginning to spill out of her in a broken whisper. We were married 2 years, and I remained barren. Every month was a fresh failure. Jacob was kind, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. His mother was not so kind. She would talk about fruitful vines and God's blessings, and look at me with such pity, as if I were a blighted field. I started to believe it, that I was empty, cursed. Then she looked up, her eyes finding a distant, painful memory. I conceived Thomas. It was a miracle. Suddenly, I had value. Jacob's mother started calling me daughter. The women in town smiled at me. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Thomas. He wasn't just my son. He was my salvation. He was my only worth. Her voice broke, and a tear slid down her cheek, catching the firelight. When Jacob died in the mine, it was horrible, but I still had Thomas. He was a piece of Jacob, my purpose. But when the fever took him, it didn't just take my son, it took everything. To Jacob's family. I was once again a barren field. Only this time I was a used-up one. I had nothing left to offer them. They gave me a little money and sent me to the church boarding house with Miriam. They washed their hands of me. When the trouble started with the pastor, they were the first ones to believe it. It was easier to believe we were sinful than to believe they had a duty to a worthless, childless widow. She finished, her story hanging in the air. A testament to a cruelty that was quiet, pious, and utterly soul-destroying. Elijah's jaw was tight, his own memories of helplessness churning in his gut. He looked at Miriam, giving her the space to speak if she chose. Her expression was hard, her face a mask of stone, but her eyes held a fire that had been banked for too long. My story is about a different kind of value, she began, her voice low and steady, though a faint tremor ran through it. Pastor Davies was a man who collected things. He collected tithes, he collected respect, and he collected secrets. When our husbands died, he offered us his spiritual counsel. He would ask me to stay after the evening service, to pray with him in his study. She paused, her gaze turning inward. At first, his words were a comfort. He spoke of God's mysterious ways, of the strength of widows, but then the nature of the counsel began to change. His hand would rest on mine a little too long during a prayer. He would stand too close, his voice a low whisper in my ear. He spoke of special grace and the temptations of the flesh. But his eyes were full of a very earthly kind of hunger. He twisted Scripture into a key to unlock my grief, trying to turn my vulnerability into his opportunity. Elijah's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He knew the type. One night, Miriam continued, her voice becoming thin and brittle, he went too far. He tried to impress upon me that my loneliness was a sin, and that he, as a man of God, could offer a divine comfort. It was a violation, not just of my body, but of my faith, of my trust. I pushed him away, and I ran. The next day, I told him I would not be returning for any more private counsel. Her face twisted in a bitter sneer. That's when he turned on us. He was a pillar of the community, and I was a poor widow with no one. He went to the church elders with a story of his own. He spoke of his pity for us, 2 lost sheep, and how I, in my grief, had become unbalanced and had offered myself to him. He painted himself as the victim, a righteous man fending off the advances of a desperate, fallen woman. He used Clara's sorrow as proof of our instability, and they all believed him. It was a much simpler story than believing their pious pastor was a wolf. She finally looked at Elijah, her eyes blazing with a cold, clear fury. They didn't just ask us to leave. They held a special prayer service for our lost souls while the whole town watched. They cast us out not with stones, but with pity and prayer, which is a far crueler weapon. We weren't just homeless. We were damned in the eyes of God and man. That is what we were running from. The cabin was thick with the poison of their stories. It was a room full of ghosts, not just of the dead, but of the lives they should have had. Elijah felt a kinship with them so profound it was a physical ache. They were not strangers, they were fellow exiles. "I have my own ghosts," he said, his voice a low rumble. And he told them. He spoke of Sarah, of her laughter that used to fill the cabin, of her quiet strength. He spoke of Lily, of her wild curls and the way she would chase butterflies in the meadow. And then he spoke of the sickness. "It came on fast," he said, his eyes fixed on the flames, seeing another time. "The doctor came once. He looked at them, shook his head, and left some powders that did nothing. He said it was in God's hands." Elijah's voice dropped, thick with a guilt so old and deep it had become a part of him. "But I was her husband. I was her father. I was supposed to be able to do something. I chopped the wood. I hunted the food. I built this house with my own hands to keep them safe. But when it came down to it, when the real danger came, I was useless. I just sat here and held their hands and watched them burn up with fever. I watched the light go out of their eyes, and I did nothing." He looked up, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I buried them on that hill, and a part of me is buried there with them. After that, I couldn't risk it again. Loving someone it's putting a gun in fate's hand and pointing it at your own heart. I swore I would never pull that trigger again." They sat in the aftermath of their shared confessions, the air finally clear. They were 3 survivors, adrift in the same boat, each with a different wound from the same storm. They were not a man and 2 women. They were 3 people who had been judged, abandoned, and left for dead by the world, and who had, by some strange miracle, found each other. They had no home to return to, because home had never been a safe place for any of them. The confession seemed to drain the last of Miriam's reserves. The emotional toll, combined with her earlier sickness and the harshness of their life, was too much. The next day, the fever returned with a vengeance. This time, it was worse. She was completely delirious, her body racked with violent shivers, her skin burning to the touch. But this time, Clara did not hover uselessly. The shared vulnerability of the previous night had forged something new in her. Her own grief, while still present, was no longer the all-consuming center of her world. She saw her sister, her only anchor, slipping away, and a fierce, protective instinct she thought had died with her son rose from the ashes. She and Elijah became a team. The awkwardness between them, the guilt from that desperate night, was burned away by the singular, urgent purpose of keeping Miriam alive. They moved in a silent, exhausted dance around the small cabin, while Elijah rode out to break ice at the creek for fresh, cold water. Clara was tearing up one of her few spare petticoats for compresses, while she spooned thin, savory broth between Miriam's cracked lips. He was brewing the strong, bitter herbal teas, his hands, so used to the axe and rifle, now surprisingly gentle. They took turns sitting by the cot, sometimes their shifts overlapping for a few minutes. In those quiet, shared moments, they spoke in low voices, not of the past or of their feelings, but of Miriam. "Her fever feels a little cooler," Clara would whisper, and Elijah would nod, placing his own large, rough hand on Miriam's forehead to check. They were no longer a man and a woman burdened by a complicated attraction, but 2 people bound by a shared love and a shared fear. Clara saw in Elijah not an object of her desperate need, but a partner, a steady, capable presence whose quiet strength she could lean on. And Elijah saw in Clara not a fragile, broken girl, but a woman of immense resilience, a gentle but unyielding fighter. A new, deeper bond was forming between them, forged in the crucible of care, a bond of respect and a quiet, profound affection. For 3 days, Miriam hovered in the gray space between life and death. On the 4th morning, Elijah was sitting by her side, dozing in the chair, when a faint sound woke him. It was his name, Elijah. He looked up. Miriam's eyes were open. They were clear. The fever was gone. She was looking at him, her gaze weak but lucid. At the sound of her voice, Clara rushed over from the hearth, her face alight with a relief so pure it was painful to see. Miriam looked from Elijah's exhausted face to Clara's tear-streaked one. She took in the basin of water, the discarded cloths, the pot of broth still warm by the fire. She understood, in a single, sweeping glance, what they had done for her. She was quiet for a long time, gathering her strength. Then she spoke, her voice a reedy whisper, but filled with a new, unshakable resolve. "I don't want to leave," she said. Clara let out a sob of pure joy and reached for her sister's hand. "Wait," Miriam said, her eyes still fixed on Elijah. "I won't be a burden, and I won't stay where I'm not wanted. I will only stay if you both truly want me to, with no debts, no obligations, just as me." It was a declaration of her worth, a final, defiant stand against a world that had always asked her to pay for her place in it. The question hung in the air. Without a moment's hesitation, Elijah reached out and took her other hand. His large, calloused hand enveloped hers. A moment later, Clara, understanding, placed her hand over both of theirs, creating a small, warm circle of connection. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The answer was in their touch, in the weary but determined look in their eyes. "Yes, we want you." Elijah looked at their joined hands, then at the faces of these two women who had become the unexpected center of his universe. The path forward was not clear. It was a trail no one had ever blazed before, but the path back was impossible. He couldn't go back to his empty, silent grief. He couldn't send them away. He took a deep breath, the words forming in his heart before they reached his lips. He knew what he was about to say was madness by the world's standards. It defied law. It defied religion. It defied everything they had ever been taught. But it felt more right, more true, than anything he had ever known. "I won't choose," he said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating with conviction in the small cabin. He looked at Clara, then at Miriam. The world outside, it broke all of us. It judged us and it cast us out. It has no right to tell us how to live, how to heal. I can't look at either one of you and say you, but not you. I can't. My heart, it's been dead for 2 years. You both brought it back to life. In different ways. You both did. He tightened his grip on Miriam's hand. "If you are willing," he said, his gaze encompassing them both. "I want you both to stay, not as guests, not as hired help, but as family, as my family. We can build a home here, the three of us, a place where no one is judged, where no one is worthless, a place where we are all just wanted." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. Her mind, conditioned by years of sermons and societal rules, struggled to comprehend what he was suggesting. A man living with 2 women? It was a scandal. It was a sin. The words of Pastor Davies, of her mother-in-law, echoed in her head. But then she looked at her sister, and she saw something she hadn't seen in months, perhaps years. A slow, radiant smile was spreading across Miriam's face. It was not the fleeting, sad smile she had seen before. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated hope. A smile of someone who had been asked what she wanted and had been given it. It was the smile of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of running, found a place to stand her ground. Seeing that smile, all of Clara's fear, all her conditioning, all her jealousy, melted away. Her sister's happiness was more real, more important than any rule the outside world had ever written. What Elijah was offering was not a sin. It was a sanctuary. It was a chance for her sister, and for her, to finally be happy. Tears welled in Clara's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of overwhelming, complicated joy. She looked at Elijah, then at her smiling sister, and through her tears, she nodded. The tentative peace that had settled over the cabin was as fragile as the first green shoots pushing their way through the melting snow. With Miriam's recovery and the momentous decision they had made, a new dynamic had taken root. The oppressive silence was replaced by the quiet hum of a shared life. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken understanding. There was laughter now, a sound so foreign in the cabin that it felt like a miracle. It was in the small moments, when Clara, attempting to bake bread for the first time, covered herself in a dusting of flour, when Elijah, repairing a harness, told a dry, funny story about a stubborn mule from his youth, when Miriam, watching them, would shake her head with that rare, beautiful smile. They were building a life. They spoke of the future, a concept that had once been a terrifying void for all of them. They planned a small garden near the cabin come the full thaw, arguing playfully over what to plant. They worked as a unit, Elijah and Miriam handling the heavier chores with a comfortable, synchronized rhythm, while Clara brought a new sense of order and warmth to the cabin itself. The lines of their arrangement blurred and disappeared, replaced by the simple, undeniable fact of their togetherness. The cot where Elijah had nursed Miriam became their shared space for mending clothes or reading by the fire. The loft was no longer just the sisters' refuge, but a quiet space for them all. The cabin had ceased to be his, and had become theirs. It was home. But the spring that melted the snow also cleared the paths. The isolation that had been their shield was gone. The outside world, with its rigid rules and unforgiving judgments, was once again within reach. The harbinger of that world arrived on a surprisingly warm afternoon in late April. He was a man on horseback, dressed in the severe black of a preacher. Elijah recognized him as Reverend Miller, a man from the town down in the valley who had a small parish and an outsized sense of his own righteousness. He was Elijah's nearest neighbor, if a half-day's ride could be called near. They exchanged terse greetings a few times a year. Miller dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with a pinched, critical air. He saw Elijah splitting wood, but he also saw Miriam stacking it with an easy competence, and Clara nearby, hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines. He saw the simple, domestic tableau, and his mind, trained to see sin in every shadow, immediately interpreted it in the darkest possible terms. "Elijah," the Reverend began, his voice oozing a counterfeit cordiality. "It is good to see the Lord has seen you through another harsh winter." He had little to do with it, Elijah grunted, sinking his axe into the chopping block and turning to face the man. Hard work and a good stock of wood did the trick. Miller's thin smile didn't waver. His gaze shifted pointedly to Miriam and Clara, who had both stopped their work and were now standing quietly, their expressions guarded. "And it appears you have had company to help you through the cold months." They were caught in the first big storm, needed shelter, Elijah said, his tone flat and uninviting. "Ah, an act of Christian charity. Commendable," Miller said, though his eyes said something else entirely. "And they are still here. The storms have been over for many weeks now." It was not a question. It was an accusation. "The passes were blocked. Travel wasn't safe," Elijah replied, his voice growing hard. He took a half-step forward, unconsciously placing himself between the preacher and the women. "Of course," Miller said, his eyes glinting. "But surely it is safe enough now for these two ladies to continue on their journey. A man's homestead, you understand, is a place of solitude and propriety. Tongues in town might begin to wag. Your reputation." "My reputation is my business," Elijah cut in, his patience gone. "And what happens on my land is my business. They are staying." The preacher's facade of pleasantry finally dropped. His face darkened, and his voice took on the booming, condemnatory tone he likely used in the pulpit. "Elijah, I speak to you as a friend and as a servant of God. You are harboring two women of known ill repute, women who were cast out from their last community for their sinful ways, to live with them under your roof, alone, in this unconventional manner, is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. It is a flagrant sin, and I am warning you to repent of it before you invite damnation upon this house." Miriam flinched as if struck, the old wounds torn open anew. Clara shrank back, her newfound confidence crumbling. But Elijah did not flinch. He looked the preacher dead in the eye, his own face a mask of cold fury. "These women have more decency and honor in their little fingers than you have in your entire pious body," Elijah said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They were the victims, not the sinners. Now get off my land before you find out what a real sinner looks like." Reverend Miller, taken aback by the ferocity in Elijah's voice, sputtered for a moment, his face turning a blotchy red. "You will regret this, Elijah. The Lord will not be mocked. You have chosen the path of wickedness, and the righteous will not stand for it." He clambered back onto his horse, shot one last venomous look at the three of them, and galloped away, a black crow fleeing back to the valley to spread his carrion news. And spread it he did. The story Reverend Miller told in town was a lurid and twisted thing. He spoke of a good man, a grieving widower, who had been bewitched and led into a den of iniquity by two wicked Jezebels. He confirmed all the worst suspicions the town of Harmony Creek had held about the two disgraced widows. The tale spread like wildfire. From the church pews to the general store, from the saloon to the blacksmith's shop. It was a scandal, juicy and self-righteous, and the town feasted on it. A week later, a formal delegation arrived. It was the town sheriff, a portly man named Blevins, who valued an easy life above all else, and one of the church elders, a stern, gray-faced man named Abernathy. They rode up to the cabin, their expressions grim and official. They refused to dismount. Sheriff Blevins cleared his throat, avoiding Elijah's gaze. "Elijah," he said, his voice full of faint regret. "We've had reports. The town council has met. People are concerned for your soul and for the moral character of this territory." "Get to it, Blevins," Elijah said, his arms crossed over his chest. Miriam and Clara stood just inside the doorway behind him, silent witnesses. "The church requests the presence of Miriam and Clara Hale," Elder Abernathy announced, his voice like the crack of a whip. "They are to come to the church on Sunday to account for their behavior and to be counseled on the path of righteousness." "They won't be going," Elijah stated flatly. Abernathy's eyes narrowed. "It is not a request they are in a position to refuse." He then turned his attention fully to Elijah. "As for you, the men of this town have a certain respect for you. You are a hard-working man who has known his share of tragedy. They are willing to look past this indiscretion. If you have any honor left, you will send these women on their way. Immediately. Rid yourself of this stain, and your place in this community can be restored." "This is my place," Elijah said, gesturing to the cabin, the mountains, the two women behind him. "And this is my family. You can tell the town council and your righteous church to go to hell." The sheriff paled, and the elder's face turned purple with rage. "You are making a grave mistake," Abernathy spat. "The community will not tolerate this. We will not have this filth in our midst. You are casting your lot with sinners, and you will share their fate." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. The community did not tolerate it. The first attack came 2 nights later. They were asleep when a rock shattered the single glass-paned window, showering the floor with glittering shards. It was followed by another, and another, thudding against the log walls of the cabin. A chorus of drunken shouts came from the darkness. "Sinners! Whores! Get out of our valley!" Elijah grabbed his rifle and burst out the door, firing a single shot into the air. The shouts turned to panicked yelps, and he heard the sound of men scrambling away in the darkness. He stood there for a long time, the cold night air on his skin, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and fear. Inside, Miriam and Clara were sweeping up the broken glass, their faces pale but resolute. They had boarded up the window with a spare plank, plunging the cabin into a new level of dimness. The next morning, they found one of the new calves, born just a month before, lying dead in the corral. There were no marks on it, no signs of a predator, just a stillness that was unnatural. Elijah found the half-eaten block of poisoned salt lick tossed into the corner of the field. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was an attack not just on them, but on their future, on the very life they were trying to build. Clara wept, but Miriam's face was set in a hard, grim line. They would not be broken by this. But Elijah knew it couldn't end here. They had invaded his home, terrorized his family, destroyed his property. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. He spent the day sharpening his axe, cleaning his rifle, his movements filled with a quiet, deadly purpose. "Don't go," Miriam pleaded with him that evening, her hand on his arm. "It's what they want, a confrontation." "If I don't go, they'll just come back," he said, his voice low and determined. "They'll keep coming back until we're gone or dead. A man has to stand his ground. This is our ground." The next day, he rode into town. He didn't take his rifle. He knew that would only lead to a hanging. He was going to face them as a man. He found them, as he knew he would. Gathered outside the saloon, a group of about 6 men, led by a burly ranch hand named Jebediah, who had always been more mouth than sense. Reverend Miller stood on the porch of the general store across the street, watching, a silent, pious instigator. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." Jebediah sneered as Elijah dismounted. "Come to town to get rid of your trash." "Elijah?" "I came here to tell you to stay off my land," Elijah said, his voice calm and even, but carrying a dangerous weight. "What I do and who I live with is my business. The attacks stop now." Jebediah laughed, and the other men joined in. "Or what? You gonna have your 2 whores come and protect you?" Something inside Elijah snapped. He moved faster than any of them expected, his fist connecting with Jebediah's jaw with a sickening crack. The big man staggered back, surprise and pain on his face, and then they were all on him. It was a desperate, brutal fight. Elijah was strong, toughened by years of hard labor, and he fought with the fury of a man defending his home. He broke one man's nose and sent another sprawling into a horse trough, but he was 1 against 6. They were a pack of dogs, swarming him with fists and boots. He was dragged to the ground, the dust filling his mouth. A boot connected with his ribs, and he felt a sharp, searing pain, a crack that stole his breath. Another blow caught him on the side of the head, and the world exploded into a shower of bright, painful stars. He fought on, fueled by sheer will, but he was drowning in a sea of violence. The last thing he remembered was the face of Reverend Miller, watching from across the street, his expression one of grim satisfaction, before the world went black. He awoke to pain, a throbbing, all-encompassing pain that seemed to radiate from every part of his body. He was lying on his back, and the world was swaying. It took him a moment to realize he was in the back of a buckboard wagon, a rough blanket thrown over him, the old, grizzled face of Silas Croft, a prospector who lived up in the hills and kept to himself, peered down at him. "You're a damn fool, Elijah." Silas grunted, though his eyes were not unkind. "But you ain't a bad man. They were gonna finish you, left you for dead." Silas helped him back to the cabin. Miriam and Clara's faces, when they saw him, were masks of horror. They half carried, half dragged him inside, hissing in sympathy with every pained groan he couldn't suppress. They stripped off his torn, bloody shirt, revealing a torso that was a landscape of purple and black bruises. His ribs were clearly broken, and a deep gash on his temple was still weeping blood. They worked together, their earlier nursing of Miriam a dress rehearsal for this. They cleaned his wounds with whiskey and hot water, their hands surprisingly steady. They bound his ribs tightly with torn sheets, their touch gentle but firm. Clara brewed a strong, bitter tea for the pain. while Miriam stitched the gash on his head with a fine needle and thread, her face a mask of intense concentration. He was helpless in their hands, reduced to a broken, hurting animal, and they were his fierce, tender protectors. That night, the pain was too great for him to move from the cot. The small bed became the center of their world. He drifted in and out of a feverish, painful sleep. At one point, he woke in the deep dark of the night, a low moan escaping his lips. He felt a cool hand on his forehead. It was Clara. "Shh," she whispered. "We're here." He turned his head slightly and saw that Miriam was there too, on his other side. They couldn't leave him. They wouldn't. Seeing him shiver, they made a silent decision. Clara slipped under the blankets on one side of him, and Miriam on the other. They didn't lie with him. They lay beside him, bracketing his broken body with their warmth and their presence. It was not an act of passion, but of profound solidarity. His head rested near Miriam's shoulder, and Clara's hand rested gently on his arm. A steady, reassuring weight. He could feel the soft, even rhythm of their breathing. He was in agony, but for the first time since Sarah had died, he did not feel alone in his pain, surrounded by their warmth, their quiet strength, their fierce, protective love. He finally surrendered to a deep, healing sleep. He woke again just before dawn. The pain was still there, a dull, heavy ache, but the fever had receded. He was still lying between them. Their faces were peaceful in the pale, gray light in this small, battered cabin, in this bed of pain. They were a strange and broken trinity, but they were whole. They were a fortress. "They think this will make us run," Miriam whispered, her voice barely disturbing the silence. She hadn't been asleep. Elijah turned his head, a painful, difficult movement. He looked past her, to the window they had boarded up against the world. "This is our home," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. Clara stirred on his other side, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, then at her sister, and a look of absolute, unwavering resolve settled on her face. "We're not running anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We will protect it, together." They lay there in the quiet dawn. Three broken people who had found their home in each other. The world had come for them with its stones and its poison and its fists. It had left them battered and bleeding, but it had not broken them. It had only forged them into something stronger, something new. They had made their stand, and they were not giving up another inch of ground. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. It waged a slow, determined war against the winter, its battalions of sunlight advancing across the valley each day, driving the snow into a full retreat. The creek, which had been a choked ribbon of ice, broke free with a roar, its water running high and brown and full of life. The skeletal branches of the aspens began to blush with the promise of new leaves, and the air, once thin and sharp enough to cut, grew soft and smelled of damp earth and pine. For the three inhabitants of the cabin on the hill, the changing of the season was a reflection of their own internal thaw, the violence of the town's assault, and their unified stand against it had been a crucible. It had burned away the last of their doubts, their shame, and their fear, leaving behind something hard, pure, and unbreakable. Elijah's broken body healed, his ribs knitting together with a dull ache that was a constant reminder of what he had fought for. But it was their spirits that saw the most profound healing. They were no longer three separate, wounded souls seeking shelter, but a single, cohesive unit. They were a family. The months that followed were a blur of purposeful, life-affirming work. Their first act of reconstruction was to replace the boarded-up window. Elijah rode out to a trading post 2 days' ride to the west, deliberately avoiding the town in the valley, and returned with a new pane of glass. As they fitted it into the frame, the cabin was once again flooded with light, a symbolic cleansing of the darkness that had been thrown at them. The light illuminated the changes within. They expanded the cabin, adding a small, lean-to room onto the back. It was hard, grueling work, felling the trees, stripping the logs, and fitting them together. But they did it together, their movements falling into an easy, practiced rhythm. Miriam proved to be as strong and capable as any man, her determination a match for Elijah's endurance, while Clara, with a newfound practicality, organized the work, managed their supplies, and kept them fed and cared for. The sound of their hammering and sawing echoed through the foothills, a defiant declaration of their intent to not just survive, but to thrive. They tilled a plot of land beside the cabin, their hands digging into the rich, dark earth. This was Clara's domain. She, who had once believed she was a barren field, now found a deep, abiding joy in coaxing life from the soil. She planted rows of beans, squash, and corn, tending to the fragile seedlings with the same fierce, gentle care she had once reserved for her lost child. Her grief had not vanished, but it had transformed. The hollow ache was still there, but now it was filled with the quiet hope of the coming harvest. The calf they had lost was a painful memory, but they would not be intimidated. Elijah traded several cured pelts for 2 pregnant ewes and a young, hardy sow. Their small homestead began to teem with new life, the bleating of lambs and the squeal of piglets replacing the mournful silence of the winter. They were building a world for themselves, a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness, a place governed not by the rigid doctrines of the town, but by their own simple creed of work, loyalty, and love. The town in the valley fell into a watchful, resentful silence after Elijah's brutal, defiant stand, and Silas Croft's pointed telling of the story of a 6-on-1 fight. A certain shame had settled over the more decent folk, the more zealous, like Reverend Miller and Elder Abernathy, continued to preach about the den of sin on the mountain, but their words began to lose their fire. Their crusade had failed. Riders from the valley would sometimes pass on the main trail below the homestead, and they would see the 3 of them working in the yard. They would see the new room on the cabin, the smoke curling contentedly from the chimney, the neat rows of the garden. They would see Miriam and Elijah working side by side, moving with an easy familiarity, and see Clara laughing as she threw feed to the chickens. What they saw was not sin and misery, but an industrious peace, a contentment that seemed to elude many of the normal, God-fearing couples in their own town. They saw a happiness they could not understand, and because they could not understand it, they hated it, but they no longer had the will to try and destroy it. They simply looked away, their silence a mixture of contempt and a grudging, unspoken defeat. One day in early summer, they received their first visitor since the trouble. It was a rickety wagon pulled by an old mule, and on the seat were Silas Croft and his wife, Elspeth. They were a quiet couple who, like Elijah, kept to the high country, their own past rumored to hold some long-forgotten scandal that had made them outcasts. They did not come to the cabin, but stopped the wagon at the edge of the path. Silas, his face as weathered as a rock, gave a curt nod. Elspeth, a small, bird-like woman with kind eyes, pointed to the back of the wagon. "Thought you might have a use for these," she said, her voice a soft, reedy thing. In the back of the wagon were several dozen healthy-looking seedlings, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. They grow well in this soil. It was more than a gift of plants. It was an offering of solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement from one set of outcasts to another. Miriam walked to the wagon, her hands clasped in front of her. "We don't have anything to trade," she said softly. Elspeth's eyes crinkled in a smile. "Some things ain't for trading," she said. She looked past Miriam, at Elijah and Clara standing on the porch, and her smile widened slightly. "A strong fence makes for a good home. Looks like you've built a strong one." She and Silas said no more, turning the mule around and creaking back down the path, leaving the seedlings behind like a silent blessing. As the days grew long and warm, another change, the most profound of all, became apparent. It was Clara. The listless fragility was long gone, replaced by a vibrant energy. Her cheeks, once pale and gaunt, were now full and rosy, and she was carrying new life within her. She told them one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the western sky. She didn't say it with fear or shame, but with a quiet, wondering joy. "I am with child," she said, her hands resting protectively on her still flat stomach. A profound silence settled over the porch. The last rays of the sun painted their faces in gold. The question, the obvious, damnable question the outside world would ask, hung unspoken in the air. But it was a ghost with no power here. Elijah looked at Clara, at the radiant hope in her eyes, and he felt not a flicker of the guilt or confusion that had once tormented him. He felt only a deep, protective surge of joy. He looked at Miriam and saw her face break into the purest, most beautiful smile he had ever seen. She went to her sister, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. "It is a blessing," Miriam whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A blessing for all of us." This child, conceived in a moment of desperate, shared grief, would not be a symbol of a mistake or a sin. It would be the foundation of their future. It was not his child, or another man's child. It was their child, the child of this strange, resilient, loving family. In that moment, Elijah knew with an absolute certainty that had eluded him his entire life, that he would protect this child, and these two women, with his last breath. He had not just found a reason to live again, he had found a reason to build a dynasty, however small and strange. On this mountain, the summer nights were warm, and they would often sit out on the porch long after the sun had set, talking in low voices under a blanket of stars. One evening, Miriam was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands busy with a needle and a square of soft, undyed wool. For weeks, she had been working on it, her stitches small and perfect. She was embroidering something onto the cloth with dark blue thread. "What are you making?" Clara asked, her head resting sleepily on Elijah's shoulder. Miriam held it up for them to see in the moonlight. The stitches formed a simple, elegant script. It read, "We need no one's understanding, only to love one another." It was their declaration of independence, their family crest, the simple, profound truth upon which they had built their new world. It was a testament to the fact that home was not a place defined by others, but a sacred space created by the love of those within it. The story ends here, but it does not truly end. It continues in the turning of the seasons, in the rhythm of a life built by three people who chose to defy a world that had cast them out. It ends on an evening in late summer, the air tinged with the first cool promise of autumn. The sun is setting, painting the vast Montana sky in impossible shades of orange and pink and deep, royal purple. The three of them are sitting on the porch of the cabin they built together. Elijah is in the center, his shoulders broad and relaxed, his hand resting on the swell of Clara's belly as she leans against him. On his other side, Miriam sits in the rocking chair, her head tilted back, her expression one of utter peace. The embroidered cloth lies folded in her lap. There is no need for words. They look at each other, and in their shared gaze there is no trace of the sorrow, the shame, or the regret that had once defined them. There is no guilt in Elijah's eyes, only a deep, steady love. There is no desperate grief in Clara's, only a radiant, maternal hope. And there is no bitter hardness in Miriam's, only a quiet, profound contentment. They are not perfect, and their life is not easy, but it is a life they have chosen. It is a life of their own making. They had all come to this place seeking refuge from a storm, but in the shelter of each other's broken hearts, they had found something far rarer, far more precious than a simple haven. They had found a home, built not on the laws of God or man, but on a love that was brave enough to make its own rules. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories. And don't forget to share your thoughts.